We are very proud of the investments we've made the last couple of years in running data-driven campaigns and decisions. When they ask us, why are you worth investing in? And I say, because we make the hard decisions for you.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Our guest today is Edith Jorge-Tuñón. She's the Deputy Executive Director of the Republican State Leadership Committee. We'll call it the RSLC for the rest of the episode. The RSLC helps state legislative candidates across the country win their elections. They've just come off of a very successful 2021 election season. We'll dive into that and much more in the show. Edith, what is the RSLC and what is its role in the Republican ecosystem?
RSLC, Republican State Leadership Committee, essentially we're the only national committee that focuses on state level races, all 50 states. And underneath RSLC, think of that as the umbrella kind of organization. We have 5 different caucuses. Within those caucuses, we kind of serve lieutenant governors, ag commissioners, secretary of states, the legislators, that being our largest caucus. And then we have a 5th and final that focuses on kind of judicial races across the country as well. So as I mentioned, only organization that kind of provides help to all 50 states at the state level. And the way that I like to kind of also compare it is think of it the same way that you have the RNC, kind of that big umbrella. And then underneath it, you'll have the NRCC, the NRSC, RGA, and we would fall in there as the RSLC.
Got it. So it is a really unique perspective to these races that a lot of people don't think about or maybe not pay enough attention to, because the Secretary of State, the Ag Commissioner, these are campaigns or elected officials, includes the judicial stuff, that have really, I think, more direct impact on what happens to your day to day. Give us a little sense of the stakes of what these elected officials are responsible for.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously differs from state to state, which makes our job extra exciting. In some cases, it's kind of dependent on the government to elect their secretaries or their ag commissioners, using those 2 examples specifically. And in others, they do run as statewide elected officials. One quick example I'll give you, which is probably going to be one of our most targeted statewide races next year, believe it or not, is going to be the ag commissioner race in the state of Florida. Right now, no Democrat holds a statewide office except for the ag commissioner. And so it's our goal to get in there and hopefully take that back. And that's a really good example of a position that, to your point, you wouldn't think ag commissioner, can throw a ton of weight around. But in a state like Florida, they actually do carry quite a bit of weight and are in charge of a number of different kind of departments that you wouldn't traditionally see of an ag commissioner in, say, Wyoming or Idaho or one of those more rural states.
So it's really interesting just to see how these roles, even though they don't get a lot of attention, have a lot of impact in our daily lives. Edith, we spoke in an earlier episode with Kevin McLaughlin about the NRSC, the Republican Senatorial Committee. And so our listeners have that organization as a frame of reference. What is the difference between working with state candidates as opposed to candidates at the U.S. federal level?
The first thing that comes to mind, which is probably the biggest difference, is we deal with many more candidates at once. I think NRCC, so the Congressional Committee, probably is the second most like us in that similarly they're dealing with literally hundreds of campaigns at a time. But when thinking about our legislative caucus, which is our largest caucus, I mean, we literally are talking about hundreds of campaigns all happening at once. So it's tracking as many of these as possible. Quite frankly, not just tracking them as the election cycle's happening, but also post-election day to kind of be able to then go back and say, okay, well, this is how many seats we won or how many we lost or what we netted or, how many of these folks are female or diverse candidates. And so, for a really long time, we did a good job of just tracking our pluses and minuses. But we're now at a point in the committee where we want to grow beyond that and try to really dig deep into the data to be able to show how are we growing as a party, not just in numbers, but in what our electeds look like, what our candidates look like, and also the resources that we're able to kind of share with them.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge, just practically speaking out of that, is probably that instead of one federal election set of laws, right, that you have to follow, you've got 50 different states and every state is different. Can you go into a little bit more of the practical considerations that come from crossing state lines, as it were, and dealing with dozens of different regulatory regimes?
That's a really good point, Eric. That's something we kind of deal with every day here, because it can literally be something as simple as, what kind of conversation can I be having a conversation with some of these folks, or something, less complicated as, if we want to coordinate, what does our disclaimer have to be? So the three main ways that we as a committee kind of engage in state elections, it's either directly through contributions to a candidate, a committee, a caucus, so on and so forth. The second way would be through coordinated efforts, obviously depending on the state. So we work directly with whether it's independent expenditure groups or the caucus, or whomever in the state is kind of taking the charge. And then the final way would be through independent expenditures. Usually either we are dealing in a state that's very restricted in what we can and can't do, or we choose to run some type of IE on our own for a candidate or several candidates, or whatever the case may be. To your point, depending on the state, we would kind of go about it differently. And a big consideration behind all of this is a couple of things. It's at what state is this team in terms of their kind of campaign building, right? So are we working with folks that have been doing this for, 10 plus years, 20 plus years? They know what they're doing. They have a good structure on the ground, and we can kind of really work with them or rely on them to kind of pick up and run, so to speak? Or is this a state that maybe doesn't have as much experience in the caucus world or in the campaign world? Usually you tend to see those a little more in either states we haven't necessarily dealt with in the past, or kind of some of these bluer states that just don't have the resources necessary to be able to be running at, the pace of one of these really red states. And so we take all of these measures into consideration, and that's kind of how we'll base our decision on how do we engage, where do we engage. And then last but not least, it's obviously, what does the data tell us? We are very, very proud of the investments we've made the last couple of years in running data-driven campaigns and decisions. And so we always say, when they ask us, why are you worth investing in? And I say, because we make the hard decisions for you, right? Mm-hmm. We're never going to lie to you and tell you we can win a race we can't win. We're not going to tell you we can pick up a chamber that we can't. We're always going to be very honest about what we think is realistic. And a big part of that is because a good chunk of our budget goes into data. And so we're not going into some of these states just kind of saying, yeah, we're going to win back the New York Assembly and, trying to get as much money out of that as possible. We're going to say, okay, let's take a look at the data. If this looks like a smart move, if we think we can pick up some seats, then we're going to go in there. We're going to see what we can do. But I would say those are kind of like the main criteria is to give you a sense of why or how we play.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting dynamic that differs. So just to draw some distinctions between, again, like the NRCC at the federal level, because you are sort of one step removed from those state leaders, they're worried about the next 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. And of course, RSLC cares about that too. But you can say, look, if we do want to flip a chamber in this state, what would it look like as an 8-year project? And mapping it out, and what is the data, and then of course the data and the status of the voter files and all that again changes by state. So I think it's really important that people understand how complex your job is. It's not just sort of say, okay, here are 40 swing seats that are going to determine who controls the gavel. You actually have to do that 40 times 50 states. Just about every one of them, except for Nebraska, has 2 chambers. I want to dig in a little bit on what it's like running state legislative campaigns. So, Edith, you've been a very early supporter of Startup Caucus in our community, which I think gives you a unique perspective into some of these challenges. What do entrepreneurs need to understand about selling to state caucuses or state level candidates?
I mean, the main thing is they don't have the budget that your federal candidates have. I think you're better off if you can try to offer a service that provides the caucus a service to their members. And when I say members, I don't just mean their electeds, but obviously their candidates as well. So, and Eric, you're right. I've met with a ton of folks over at Startup, and this is kind of always a conversation that I have with them too, is like, if you really want to get your foot in the door at state level politics, you have to think a little broader than just going after like 1, 2, 10, 12 candidates. It's really, how can you offer, the larger committee a product that they can then go offer their members. And in most cases, it's free of charge. But because caucus are, the caucus is your kind of, and I'm just kind of honing in on the legislative right now because I think this example makes sense. But caucuses are kind of like your main line to resources, right? They're there to help you get elected. If you're elected, they're there to kind of ensure that you get reelected. And so they're always looking for new opportunities to, give something to their members, give something to their candidates to kind of further prove the value of having them established in a state. So that's kind of always my number one thing. And quite frankly, number two, the reality, the first thing I mentioned was the budget isn't, there at a local level that it is at a federal level, although some of these legislative races have, really been kind of pumping up their numbers lately. So you're looking at these races that are being, you are spending millions in them, or millions are being spent in them, better said. But, it also helps cut down on kind of having to go out and, like I said, try to find, 10 different clients, at maybe half of what you would be charging a federal campaign. And that's gracious. When you can just kind of have this one main artery that then helps you supply business to numerous candidates.
Right. So I think there are two things I want to dig into there. First is it's a good example of the next frontier of technology and innovating in politics, because I really think that we're at this sort of stage between what I call 2.0 and 3.0. So 2.0 is really using the internet well and transforming the total digitization of campaigns, right? And that's where we are. We're starting to see some glimpses of what 3.0 looks like, which is, more ownership, control by supporters. But you've got the big Senate races, you've got the big congressional races, gubernatorial races, who they can build huge email lists. They've got really good advertising, targeting budgets, and all those sorts of things. It's those thousands of campaigns that, may spend between $10,000 and $100,000 that we need to figure out, how do we get them pulled into the 21st century of digital campaigning. And so that's why I think it's such an exciting frontier with where you're working, and one that I would encourage other entrepreneurs who are listening to this to say, this is a space where technology actually is going to have a real impact in terms of driving down costs and adding capabilities.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And here's the thing too, we just haven't gotten there on our side. Democrats realistically have been doing this for years now. And, case in point, Act Blue. They are able to raise hundreds of thousands of low dollar contributions to, Texas is a great example of this in 2020. Elizabeth Guzman, if I'm not mistaken, she was running for a special election there earlier in the year. And within the first month of it, I think it was January, end of December, January, she raised six figures just from contributions coming outside of Texas.
Which is wild.
It's wild. And the thing is that, I can't point to a single Republican legislative campaign candidate elected that has probably ever been able to do that with an online presence, right? Not that, they went out to California and raised six figures, but that, just through low dollar fundraising, just through utilizing different digital platforms and, strategies, they raised that amount of money. And so, that is, to your point, that makes me happy, because it makes me think, okay, we can only get better at this point because we're nowhere near that. But how we get there, I think, is what's going to be interesting, in big part because the technology on the Republican side is just starting to get there, right? And we have a lot to learn. And they've been doing this for, the better part of 10 plus years now. So they've kind of really gotten it down to a science. And then the last component in all of this, and back to your point on why it makes it even more difficult for us, is that at the federal level, it's one set of laws, right? For us, it's 50 different sets of laws. If we were to, try to do some type of conduit email fundraising with, using Texas again as the example, with, the speaker's kind of political arm, we'd have to follow all of the same, legal kind of elect laws in the state of Texas, and then they'd be completely different if we tried to do the same thing in Florida. So it definitely provides for a fun little puzzle for Republican operatives and digital folks.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Edith Jorge-Tuñón, the Deputy Executive Director of the RSLC, and we're digging into state legislative races and how technology is transforming them. I want to back up, Edith, and a really important thing that's just we need to underline is that these races are so important because it is the bench of the future of the Republican Party, right? The vast majority of our members of Congress, senators, governors start out as state legislators. And so that's another reason why I really encourage entrepreneurs and startup founders to focus on this market, because that is a customer base that is going to grow with you over the next decade. And so talk about the role that RSLC plays in developing the bench for the Republican Party, because I think that's sort of under the radar of what you guys are doing right now.
That's been a huge priority of ours. It certainly has been for me since I came on board. I think we can't do what we do, and that's across the board, from raising, money to winning elections to, having the leadership involvement that we do, without the teams on the ground. They are the reason we are successful. We have had a really good dialogue with folks on the ground about, the image of the Republican Party. And it hasn't been, us kind of saying like, hey guys, you need to do better. It's actually been the other way around. It's been, hey, how do we do better? What are you seeing other states do to recruit, younger people to run for office, to recruit more females, to recruit more diverse candidates? And like, that's been so uplifting as well, because the same way that I came here in 2019 and that was a priority to me, I immediately saw that it's also a priority to a lot of our folks in our states. And they're already kind of trying to think bigger picture of, okay, we need to really, show how inclusive we are as a party. How do we do that? And so we work with all of our members, with all of our caucuses, with all of our operatives on really thinking through how do we expand this party, not just on an engagement kind of level, but also when looking at some of these folks running that maybe they're not necessarily going to win this time around. They might, run again and still not be the right time, right place, but where we build a bench for years to come, right? And a lot of that has to do with how do we train some of these folks? How do we get them into a room and really have them see what it is to run an election, but also, what are the tools available to be able to win some of these elections, some of these races, and that kind of comes full circle to there are so many things available to individuals today, whether it's through us, whether it's through their caucus, whether it's through actual vendors and different companies that they can work with, but where not only is it possible to win in some of these more difficult seats, but it's not going to cost you what it traditionally would have cost you. So all of this to say, where we had a district that maybe it would be great for, a school teacher to run in, but the school teacher's number one concern is, hey, I don't think I can raise what some of these folks are spending to win an election. Well, the beauty of it is there, we can professionally say we have been outspent as bad as 20-1 and still won some of these races. And it's because I do feel that we just are much smarter about how we utilize the tools that we have available to us.
Yeah, but being the technology is sort of changing the equation that being outraised isn't the death sentence it used to be, right? Because we can be smarter with our data and our targeting and how we're reaching voters. So, Edith, I want to dig into, obviously, we had some very competitive state legislative elections in Virginia where Republicans regained control of the majority there. I know that was a big priority for RSLC, but also in New Jersey, where we had some sort of headline makers with some important elections there. What are some of the trends that we saw in those legislative elections that might carry over to the midterms, whether down ballot or up top of the ticket?
Yeah, I mean, and we saw this in 2020, saw it again a lot in 2021, and I've been calling them out on it since. So I don't know whether or not they're listening and or are going to learn their lesson. But number one trend is the left still, as a big part of their kind of game book, if you will, is television, broadcasting cable. And I'm talking about like more than 50% of what I imagine some of these campaign budgets are going just to television, and it's all post Labor Day.
Wow.
That is insane to me. We had one campaign in Virginia. The guy spent over $500,000 on broadcast and cable, is going to lose. He's actually trying to challenge his loss, but he's going to lose by about 100 votes. Our candidate spent probably half of that, with obviously our help and kind of all of the coordination we were able to do, which Virginia is great in that respect. But with her campaign team, between us, the caucus, all of us kind of really day to day making these difficult decisions, we made a very kind of conscientious decision to not try to even get close to matching him on television. There was no way that we were going to be able to. But what we did do, and we did this kind of across the board, I mentioned, in Virginia alone, our budget was, we probably spent close to 3.2, but likely a little higher, $1 million. Of that, almost $500,000 was on data, from modeling to polling to kind of data storing and housing to, regular updates to the files to see kind of where we stood today, sort of thing. All of that, plus the messaging that we had been doing all summer months to very targeted households, because again, we knew we weren't going to have the money to be able to kind of go far and wide the way that they normally do. But what we also knew was that they were going to go up way later than us. So we spend all summer essentially hitting very specific households, right? Knowing who we need to be hitting with what messaging, because we've spent all this money on data to tell us exactly that. And then on top of that, we're working with folks like Numenor to then tell us like, hey, is our message working? And if so, what is this shifting? Or where is the shift going, kind of thing? Like, are there more people that we can incorporate in these universes? Are there folks that now we need to hit with a different message? In any case, we decide that we're going to go up on television in early August. And so we do, with, again, a very smart buy, because the beauty of today's day and age is that you can also target who you want on television. And on things
like addressable and custom
Correct.
audiences. Yeah.
Correct. And even honestly with Comcast, some of these folks will let you actually, buy specific to kind of cable top addresses and stuff like that, which is definitely above my pay grade, but they tell me it's being done and I believe it. So all that to say, we decided to go up with, pretty decent buys across the board in early August, completely catch them off guard, takes them 2 weeks before the first one's even able to get on TV before September. So that told us a couple of things, right? It told us, number one, their playbook was exactly the same, right? They were waiting until post Labor Day when they thought that that's actually when the race is going to start. Then they were going to just dump all of this money into like random television buys. And that's what they would do for the remainder of the 40-something days, 50 days. So we're up for about a month. They get up 2 weeks after that. They get up with positive ads, which now tells me, well, they're not doing their research either, right? Or they were waiting to, see what their best hits were on our guys, maybe do some message testing. Again, we had done all of this over the summer months, so we were literally months ahead of them. They get up with positive ads. It's not until probably mid-September to late September that we start seeing negative ads on our candidates. So again, their timeline seems to still be where it was. They're not using the targeting that we are. Also, they have much more money than us, which means they're kind of just throwing it everywhere.
Well, they don't have to be as creative.
You're absolutely right. And then again, we basically spent all summer softening the ground, transitioned to television with very targeted buys in early August, ran all the way through the end of September, after which we kind of just worked with the campaigns on making sure they were in a good place moving forward. But then we redirected everything to online, digital, social, and mailboxes, as well as a couple of traditional grassroots efforts that we paid for on the ground.
So the lesson seems to be invest early, start working early, and that this old conventional wisdom of wait until after Labor Day to officially start a campaign just isn't working anymore, because someone has done a lot of work beforehand before you even wake up. So, Edith, you have worked on a lot of campaigns and now have visibility into hundreds more. What's a problem or challenge you see that an entrepreneur who's listening today ought to work on tackling, whether that's through a business, a service, or a product?
I would love to get a sense for like, what are the sentiments at the door? You know, like when your volunteers are knocking on doors, like it's almost like I wish that there was like a ring conversation or a ring recording of every conversation that's had at the door, right? So that you could get like a real sense. And honestly, it's probably great from a safety perspective as well, right? Because you have oftentimes you have a lot of young kids or older folks at doors, and you never really know like what's happening, what's being said. But I would love to just get a sense for like when someone, you know, you always hear volunteers say, I had the best conversation at the door today. The guy said he's not going to vote or he's never voted Republican in his life, but, you know, he really likes the candidate and it's going to be the first time he ever votes for a Republican. Like, I would love to be able to see that.
Like, is that actually true? Number one, right? Yeah. So being able to dig into that. Yeah.
50% of it is accountability. The other 50% is that would be great on an ad.
It was just like that door knocker is the most persuasive political operative we have. We need to clone them and send them around.
The thing is, like, you've heard the story like every campaign cycle. So,
well, I mean, it's a tough balance, right? So, obviously, we are very data driven, and we're focusing on the tech and the tactics and measurement. And I think to some extent we over-index for measurability and data. And we forget that there's a human emotional element to these campaigns, and that voters are not rational actors, that they hear things differently than it's presented to them. They get different inputs. And so I think that's a really interesting challenge there, because people sort of say, hey, let's look at the sentiment analysis on social media. But there's this huge, I mean, having been on a campaign and been around volunteers, there sort of the unsolicited advice is a huge resource for campaigns and can sometimes be a headache. But finding a way to input that into campaigns is a really fascinating opportunity. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'm really fascinated about the doorbell cameras. And just the possibilities there. You know, if someone's not answering, you should still read your script because they're going to watch it on their phone. That's a targeted impression against a household. So fun stuff like that. Thank you, Edith, for joining us today. There's a link to the RSLC's website in the show notes, and you can find Edith on Twitter. The link is also included there. Finally, before we wrap up, please rate and review the show over on Apple Podcasts. It really helps with discovery and reaching new listeners, and that's key to the mission of growing our innovation community. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.